The emergency room was a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting that rainy Tuesday in Seattle. The wind howled against the glass panes of the hospital, matching the storm brewing inside the triage center. I have seen everything in my 15 years as a specialized nurse, but nothing prepared me for the moment the double doors swung open, revealing a man drenched in mud and tattered clothes. He looked like just another nameless person lost to the streets. A ghost in the machinery of a busy city. The paramedics were rushing, but the doctors barely looked up from their clipboards, dismissively waving him toward the furthest, darkest corner of the hallway. They saw a vagrant, a burden on the system, but as I stepped closer to check his vitals, a cold shiver ran down my spine. This man was not just another patient. My name is Elena Vance, and I grew up in a small military town, where you learn to recognize a certain type of silence before I moved here to work in this high-pressure environment. As I reached for his tattered collar to stabilize his neck, his hand suddenly shot up with a grip like cold iron, pinning my wrist. His eyes, though clouded with pain, held a terrifyingly sharp focus. He leaned in, his breath ragged, and whispered a string of alphanumeric codes that sounded like a high-level military encryption. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked down and saw a glint of gold hidden under a layer of grime near his chest. It was a heavy signet ring, hanging from a reinforced steel wire around his neck, bearing a crest that officially did not exist. At that moment, the head surgeon shouted for me to stop wasting time on an indigent, but he had no idea that the man on that stretcher held power that could level this entire building. If this story has already gripped you so far, take a moment and subscribe to the channel right now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. Please, tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I am the surgeon, a man whose ego often outweighed his clinical skill, marched over with a look of pure annoyance. He saw the way I was frozen, my wrist still caught in the old man's iron grip. To him, this was just a combative patient suffering from a substance-induced psychosis. He didn't see the calloused hands that spoke of decades of weapon handling, nor did he hear the precision in the whispered code. I tried to explain, my voice trembling slightly, that this patient required immediate neurological priority, but I was shut down with a sharp flick of his wrist. He ordered me to sedate him and move him to the observation ward, a place where patients are often forgotten for hours. I felt a surge of professional rebellion. My life in this hospital has been controversial because I refuse to stay silent when I see injustice, and this was the peak of it. I watched as they wheeled him away, his eyes never leaving mine, a silent plea for protection etched into his weathered face. I retreated to the nurse's station, my mind racing. I knew that ring. I had seen it once before in my father's old photographs from his time in special operations. It was a mark of the Silent Sentinels, a ghost unit that operated outside the standard chain of command. Why was a man of this stature arriving at a public hospital as a John Doe? I slipped into the shadows of the hallway, heading toward the observation ward against direct orders. I needed to see that ring again, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. When I reached his bed, the room was eerily quiet, the monitors barely beeping. I reached for the cord around his neck, but as I pulled the ring into the light, I realized the grime was actually tactical paint. The ring wasn't just gold, it was a key. Thank you for staying with me until now. This shows that you feel the same way I felt when I lived through all of this. So please, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because what happens next changes everything. I stood there in the dim light of the ward, the heavy ring resting in my palm. It felt unnaturally warm. As I examined the crest, I noticed a small indentation on the side, a mechanical trigger. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a sophisticated piece of hardware. Suddenly, the door to the ward creaked open. I jumped, nearly dropping the ring. It was one of the senior administrators, a man who rarely visited the floor at this hour. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the patient on the bed. He didn't see me tucked away in the corner behind the curtain. He approached the bed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a syringe filled with an unlabeled clear liquid. This was the first major turn in a night already filled with shadows. He wasn't there to heal. He was there to ensure the man never woke up. My survival instincts, honed by years of navigating hospital politics and high-stakes emergencies, kicked in. I stepped out from behind the curtain, my voice cold and professional, asking him what medication he was administering without a recorded order. He jumped, the syringe nearly falling from his hand. The look of pure terror on his face confirmed my worst fears. There was a conspiracy happening within my own walls, and it went far beyond medical negligence. He tried to brush it off, claiming it was a rapid-acting sedative for the patient's agitation, but the patient was currently unconscious. I didn't back down. I demanded to see the vial. That is when the administrator's expression shifted from fear to a cold, menacing calm. He told me that some things are bigger than a nursing license, and that I should think about my career before asking more questions. Now I want to know from you, where are you watching this story from? Write it there in the comments. It is incredible to see people from so so many places following stories like this. After the administrator left, his threat hanging in the air like a poisonous fog, I knew I couldn't trust anyone in the building. I moved the patient's bed to a different bay, one that was out of the direct line of sight from the nursing station. I had to act fast. I used a secure line to call a contact my father had mentioned years ago, a man who dealt with irregularities. As I waited for a response, I looked back at the patient. His breathing was shallow, but his pulse was steadying. He started to mumble again, but this time it wasn't codes. He was saying a name that made my heart stop. It was the name of the current Secretary of Defense. This indigent man, who the hospital treated like trash, was calling for the highest levels of government. I realized then that he wasn't just a veteran, he was a high-value asset who had been burned by his own people. The second twist was unfolding before my eyes. The hospital administration wasn't just being negligent. They were actively working with someone to silence him. I felt a wave of nausea. How many others had been silenced in these halls? I grabbed a portable ultrasound machine, pretending to perform a routine check. But I was actually scanning for any other hidden devices. Beneath the skin of his forearm, I found a small metallic object, a tracking chip, but it wasn't transmitting. It had been jammed. That's why he was here. He was hiding in plain sight, using the anonymity of a crowded, failing city hospital to escape an assassin. Have you ever been through something like this where you had to hide or stay in silence to protect yourself or someone else? Tell me your experience in the comments. Excelente. As I stared at the ultrasound screen, the cold reality of the situation began to settle in my bones. The metallic chip embedded in his arm was a silent witness to a life of shadows, and the fact that it was jammed meant he was a man on the run from people with immense resources. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind you only get when you know you are standing on the edge of a cliff. I looked at the patient, whose real name I still didn't know, and realized that by protecting him, I had just painted a target on my own back. I began to review his chart again, noticing small, deliberate errors in his blood work that could only have been placed there by someone with administrative access. This was the second major twist. The corruption wasn't just at the top. It was woven into the very fabric of our laboratory systems. They were trying to make his eventual death look like a predictable complication of his supposed lifestyle. I spent the next hour moving through the hospital with calculated precision, gathering supplies I might need if we had to move him in a hurry. My life in this city had taught me that when the system fails, you rely on your training and your gut. I found a secure corner in the supply room and made a second call, this time to an old friend in the digital forensics department. I needed to know who had accessed this patient's files in the last hour. As I waited for the information, the hospital's intercom crackled to life, announcing a code silver, a person with a weapon, in the south wing. My heart skipped a beat. It was a diversion. They were clearing the area to get to him. I rushed back to his bay, my nursing shoes squeaking on the linoleum, only to find the curtain pulled back and two men in gray uniforms standing over his bed. They didn't look like police, and they certainly didn't look like medical staff. One of them held a device that looked like a remote detonator for the jammer. I stood my ground, my voice steady despite the terror, and told them the area was under quarantine for a highly infectious disease. It was a lie, but in a hospital, fear of a virus is often more powerful than a gun. The men hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all the time I needed. I slammed the emergency lock button on the wall, a feature meant for psychiatric outbursts that now served as our only shield. The heavy magnetic doors hissed shut, sealing us inside the small isolation unit. The man on the bed suddenly opened his eyes, and the fog was gone. He looked at me, not as a patient, but as a commander assessing a soldier. He reached for the signet ring I had tucked into my pocket and slid it onto his finger with a trembling hand. He told me his name was General Arthur Vance, no relation to me, yet the coincidence felt like a sign from fate. He explained that he had been living as a homeless man for 6 months to track down a leak within the Pentagon that was selling classified coordinates to foreign entities. This was the third and most shocking twist. He wasn't a victim of a hit. He was the hunter who had been cornered. He had allowed himself to be brought here because this hospital sat on a specific communication node he needed to access. He wasn't just a patient. He was using the hospital's own infrastructure to transmit the final piece of evidence against the traitors. My jaw dropped. I had spent the night trying to save a helpless man, only to realize I was a pawn in a high-stakes game of international espionage. He told me that the administrator I had confronted was the primary contact for the buyers. The general needed 5 more minutes to complete the data burst. Outside the door, I could hear the heavy thud of the men trying to override the magnetic lock. I grabbed a heavy metal oxygen tank and positioned myself near the entrance, my hands shaking but my resolve hardening. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was the last line of defense for a man holding the safety of the country in his hands. He looked at me and whispered that if he didn't make it, I was the only one who knew the truth. The sound of the door's magnetic seal straining was like a rhythmic heartbeat of impending doom. General General Vance was typing rapidly on a small foldable keyboard he had hidden within the lining of his tattered coat, a coat the staff had intended to throw away. The contrast was staggering. A man who looked like he hadn't showered in weeks was currently navigating the most secure servers in the world. He told me that the ring was the biometric key required to bypass the final firewall. As the progress bar on his screen crawled toward 90%, the lights in the hallway outside began to flicker and then died, plunging everything into a terrifying darkness. The backup generators kicked in, bathing the ward in a sickly red emergency glow. This made the scene feel even more like a nightmare. I could hear voices now, frantic and angry, arguing about how to bypass the isolation protocol. I realized that the administrator was likely terrified that his secret was minutes away from being broadcast to the Justice Department. General Vance looked up, his face pale from the effort and the blood loss he was still suffering from. He told me that the transmission was being intercepted by the hospital's internal server. We needed to get to the main server room in the basement to bypass the block. It was a suicide mission. We would have to walk right through the men waiting for us. But then, the general smiled a grim, weary smile. He told me that he hadn't come to this hospital alone. He had sent a silent signal the moment I touched the ring. The third twist had a sublayer. The code Silver wasn't started by the villains. It was started by his own extraction team to mask their arrival. Suddenly, the ceiling panels above the hallway groaned, and the sound of heavy boots echoed from the ventilation shaft. Touching sus. The extraction was a blur of tactical precision and clinical urgency. The doors didn't just open. They were dismantled in seconds by men in black gear who moved with the grace of predators. They didn't fire a single shot, instead using non-lethal force to neutralize the administrator and his hired muscle before they even knew what hit them. General Vance was lifted onto a specialized tactical stretcher, but he grabbed my sleeve before they could wheel him away. He told the commander of the unit that I was to be given full protection, and that my actions tonight had prevented a catastrophe that would have cost thousands of lives. I stood there, surrounded by elite soldiers in the middle of a public hospital, feeling the weight of the night finally crashing down on me. The next morning, the hospital board announced that the administrator had resigned for personal reasons, and the patient I had treated was officially listed as having been transferred to a private facility. There was no mention of the general, the ring, or the encrypted data. It was as if the night had never happened, except for the small, gold-plated pen left on my desk with the emblem of the Silent Sentinels engraved on the clip. I returned to my shift, walking the same halls where I had fought for a man's life, but everything looked different. I realized that as nurses, we see the world in its rawest form, and sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that can never be told to the public. I moved to a different city shortly after, seeking a fresh start, but I always keep that pen in my pocket as a reminder that dignity isn't found in a title or a bank account, but in the truth of who a person is when no one is watching. The aftermath of that night stayed with me longer than any physical wound could. I eventually settled in a quiet town in Virginia, far from the chaotic energy of the Seattle emergency rooms. I took a job at a local clinic, where the pace was slower, and the patients were mostly neighbors I saw at the grocery store. But every time a stranger walks through the door with a certain upright posture or a look of hidden intensity in their eyes, my hand instinctively reaches for the pen in my pocket. I often wonder about General Vance, and whether the data he transmitted truly cleared the rot from the system he served. I learned that true heroism doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears scrubs and carries a stethoscope. The hospital I left behind eventually faced a massive federal audit, and several key figures disappeared from the medical community overnight. I knew why, but I kept my silence, honoring the code of the man I had saved. My life remains a balance of the ordinary and the extraordinary, a testament to the fact that a nurse's job is never just about medicine. It's about being the witness to the secrets people carry to their graves, and sometimes helping them carry those secrets back into the light. I am proud of the controversial choices I made, because I know that one man walked out of that hospital alive because I chose to see the person instead of the rags. This is the story of how a simple detail changed the course of my life and possibly the safety of many others. What would you have done in my place? Would you have risked your career for a stranger that everyone ignored? Leave your opinion in the comments, as I love reading your perspectives. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support our stories and activate notifications to be the first to know AB.